Good morning, sir. I'm Y Nikita from EC Department B section. My roll number is 21951A04C2. My topic for physics is comparison of intrinsic and extrinsic semiconductors. Comparison, classification of materials. Insulators. In case of insulators, the forbidden energy gap is very wide. Due to this, electrons cannot jump from the valency band to the conduction band. That is, in insulators, the valency electrons are bounded very tightly to their atoms. Even in presence of high electric field, electrons do not move from valency to conduction band. When the temperature is increased, some of the electrons go to the conduction band. This is the reason why some of the materials which are insulators at room temperatures are conductors at high temperatures. Semiconductors. In semiconductors, the forbidden energy gap is very small. The electrical properties of semiconductors lies between insulators and conductors. At 0 Kelvin temperature, there is no electron in the conduction band and valency band is completely filled with electrons. When a small amount of energy is supplied to the electrons can easily jump from the valency band to the conduction band. Conductors. In case of conductors, there is no forbidden energy gap and the valency band and conduction band overlap each other. Due to overlapping of the valency band and conduction band, electrons from valency band freely enter into the conduction band. Even a slight potential difference across the conductor causes the conduction electrons to constitute electric current. Classification of semiconductors. Intrinsic or pure semiconductors, extrinsic or impure semiconductors. A semiconductor which does not have any kind of impurities is known as intrinsic semiconductor. A semiconductor which has either the donor impurities or the acceptor impurities is known as the extrinsic semiconductor. Intrinsic semiconductors. An intrinsic semiconductor is formed from a highly pure semiconductor material, thus also known as pure semiconductors. These are basically undoped semiconductors that do not have doped impurity in it. At room temperature, the intrinsic semiconductors exhibit almost negligible conductivity, as no other type of element is present in its crystalline structure. The group 4 elements of the periodic table form an intrinsic semiconductor. However, mainly silicon and germanium are widely used. This is so because in their case, only a small energy is needed to break the covalent bond. The figure above clearly shows that the silicon consists of 4 electrons in the valency shell. Here 4 covalent bonds are formed between the electrons of the silicon atom. When the temperature of the crystal is increased, then the electrons in the covalent bond gained kinetic energy and after breaking the covalent bond, it gets free. Thus, the movement of free electrons generates current. The rise in temperature somewhat increases the number of free electrons for conduction. Extrinsic semiconductor. Extrinsic semiconductors are those that are the result of adding an impurity to a pure semiconductor. These are basically termed as an impure form of semiconductors. The process by which certain amount of impurity is provided to a pure semiconductor is known as doping. So we can say a pure semiconductor is doped to generate an intrinsic semiconductor. These are highly conductive in nature. However, unlike intrinsic semiconductor, extrinsic semiconductors are two types, P-type and N-type semiconductors. It is noteworthy here that the classification of extrinsic semiconductors depends on the type of element doped into the semiconductor. The P-type semiconductors are formed by introducing group 3 or a trivalent impurity into a pure semiconductor. These are also known as the acceptor impurity. As a trivalent impurity, only 3 electrons in the valency shell. The N-type semiconductors are formed by the addition of group 5 elements or the pentavalent impurities to a pure semiconductor. These are termed as donor impurity, as a pentavalent impurity holds 5 electrons in its valency shell. Here, The above figure clearly shows that a pentavalent impurity is doped to a pure silicon crystal. In this case, the electrons of phosphorus are covalently bonded with the adjacent atoms, silicon atom, but still a free electron is left free. Thus, the movement of these free electrons generates high conduction. Also, when the temperature is increased, then it causes the covalent bond to get a breakdown, hence generating more free electrons. So, this is the reason why an n-type intrinsic extrinsic has electrons as a majority charge carrier. Parameters: intrinsic and extrinsic semiconductor. Form of semiconductor. In intrinsic semiconductor, pure form of semiconductor. Extrinsic semiconductors are pure form of semiconductors. Conductivity. Intrinsic semiconductors exhibit poor conductivity, whereas extrinsic semiconductors they possess comparatively better conductivity than the intrinsic semiconductor. Band gap. The band gap between conduction and valency band is small, whereas in extrinsic semiconductors, the energy gap is high than the intrinsic semiconductor. Fermi level. It is present in the middle of the forbidden energy gap. And for the intrinsic, extrinsic, and for the extrinsic, the Fermi level is present according to the type of intrinsic semiconductor. Dependency. In intrinsic semiconductor, the conduction relies on the temperature, whereas in extrinsic semiconductor, the conduction depends on the concentration of doped impurity and temperature. Carrier concentration. Equal amount of electrons and holes are present in the conduction and valency band. The majority presence of the electrons and holes depends on the types of extrinsic semiconductor. Type. It does not, the intrinsic semiconductor is not furtherly classified. In extrinsic semiconductor, they are classified as p-type and n-type. Example: silicon, germanium, and gallium. Key differences between intrinsic and extrinsic semiconductors. The factor that generates a key difference between the intrinsic and extrinsic semiconductor is that the intrinsic semiconductors are said to be pure and thus no impurity concentration is present in it, as against extrinsic semiconductors are said to be impure as an impurity is doped in order to form it. Due to its pure form, intrinsic semiconductors possess low conductivity, while extrinsic semiconductors exhibit comparatively better conductivity than the intrinsic semiconductor. There is an almost equal concentration of electrons and holes are present in the case of an intrinsic semiconductor. On the contrary, the concentration of electrons and holes depends on the type of extrinsic semiconductor. The conductivity of an intrinsic semiconductor truly relies on the temperature. On the contrary, the conductivity of the extrinsic semiconductor depends on the temperature as well as the impurity concentration. The intrinsic semiconductor does not hold for any further classification, whereas extrinsic semiconductors are classified as p-type and n-type. Silicon or germanium are examples of intrinsic semiconductors, whereas doping arsenide or phosphorus like elements impure semiconductors forms extrinsic semiconductors like gallium arsenide or gallium phosphorus. Thank you, sir, for giving me this wonderful opportunity of sharing my views on the intrinsic and extrinsic semiconductors. Thank you so much.